I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1705 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast, news about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, we will have the privilege, again, of Dr. Bob Rodrigues, a very well-known history professor up at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who's going to be telling us more about the first democratically elected president of South Vietnam. That was a gentleman by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem. He became the president of South Vietnam in 1955. He had a very troubled term in office because of all sorts of problems going on in South Vietnam at the time. There were political problems, there were military problems, there were religious problems, there were poverty problems, there was everything. How the man lasted as long as he did, I don't know. Dr. Rodrigues is going to tell us all about his term in office. In this episode, we were going to talk about how his term ended in this episode, but it's such a dirty, nasty, grisly story. We're going to save it for its own exclusive episode next time in episode 1706. Right now, I encourage you to sit back, relax, get that pen and paper out, turn off the TV, cell phones, and everything else. Just sit down and take in all this fabulous information Dr. Rodrigues is going to share with you. So without any further ado, Dr. Rodrigues, it's all yours.
In December of 1960, we had the birth of the National Liberation Front, or the NLF. We know them better as the Viet Cong, VC. And they are formed in the South to oppose Diem's leadership. So let's define them. They are South Vietnamese living in South Vietnam. They are guerrillas, and they oppose Diem's leadership. So this is their birth. It was actually December 20th of 1960. The National Liberation Front was their official name. They were better known as the Viet Cong, and oftentimes referred to by American soldiers as simply VC. Now, in 1958, there had been a book published by Eugene Burdick and William Lederer. These were two journalists stationed in Southeast Asia, and it was technically a novel, but it was a novel with a purpose. And quite honestly, it was probably the most iconic Cold War book. And it inspired the Peace Corps eventually. But I'm going to read you a quote from The Ugly American. This is the title of the book, The Ugly American. And here's the quote. If the only price we are willing to pay is the dollar price, we had better retreat to our shores, build Fortress America, learn to live without international trade and communications, and accept mediocrity, the low standard of living, and the loom of world communism which would accompany such a move. John F. Kennedy, a senator from Massachusetts at the time, read this book and was so impressed with its message and implications that he bought 99 copies. Alaska and Hawaii had just been admitted to the Union. And he sent one copy to each senator in the kind of, it said, please read. Now I'm going to play you 3 excerpts from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address of January 20th, 1961. And listen carefully to them, and I think you will hear the ugly American.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it.
Obviously, John F. Kennedy was profoundly affected by what was going on in Southeast Asia, and I guess he channeled it through the ugly American, which brought him quite a bit of awareness to the conditions in Southeast Asia. So it obviously affected his inaugural address. In 1961, February 28th, American military personnel began to go with South Vietnamese on patrol. The United States Congress generally considers this date as the start of the Vietnam conflict, February 28th, 1961, because now our personnel are going with the Army on patrol. In April of that year, we have an event known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was launched against Cuba. The United States was trying to just dislodge Fidel Castro in Cuba because Castro was becoming increasingly communist, and of course they were 90 miles off our border. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a failure. It was an embarrassment to Kennedy. So we have to look at, where Kennedy is at this time. Now, here's a young president, 42 years old, youngest president ever elected to office. Teddy Roosevelt was younger, but he came into office after the death of McKinley. He had barely won the election by a percentage point, less than a percentage point over Richard Nixon. He was Catholic. He was the first Catholic president. So there were a lot of things that made him feel insecure at this point. But in May of 1961, he announces that it may be necessary to send ground troops into Vietnam. He sends Lyndon Johnson on a tour of South Vietnam to just kind of prop up the South Vietnamese government. And then by November, he begins sending Green Berets into South Vietnam. The Green Berets were an added arm. They were counter insurgency. So in other words, they fought like the guerrillas to counter them. And they were considered very, very stylish. 1962, February, the Diem Palace is bombed in a coup attempt. See, there were a lot of groups, different groups, and Diem, as I said, was not popular among the populace, largely due to his brother, due to his repressive measures, etc. So this was a coup attempt which failed. In May, the Senate Majority Leader in the United States, a man by the name of Mike Mansfield, is going to begin to express doubt on the United States foreign Vietnam policy. This just indicates that now Vietnam is bubbling to the surface in awareness and home front. Still not really hit the American people on the back pages of the newspapers, but now beginning to be acknowledged by some of our legislative leaders. In October, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and as you know, that was a very critical event in the Cold War. Brought us to the brink of nuclear war until the Soviets backed down and took the missiles out of Cuba. Now we're in 1963, May 1st. The Buddhists gather in the city of Hue. Hue's up along the coast, closer to the 17th parallel, to protest a Diem decree which prohibited them from flying their flag. And this was Buddha's birthday. And they wanted to fly the flag, and they were prohibited from doing so, although earlier in the year, when one of Diem's brothers became archbishop, was announced to be archbishop of Saigon, they flew Catholic flags, all over Vietnam. So this was a, example of duplicity, okay, in terms of policy, as interpreted by the Buddhists. So Diem now begins to persecute the Buddhists. He begins to see the Buddhists as a problem, the Buddhist problem, because first of all, they're large in number. They become very aware of American politics. And even when they have parades, none of them spoke English, but they carried banners that were in English because they knew Americans were, sending all this, the film back home, and they were, preaching to the choir, so to speak. On May 8th, of 63, Diem's troops are going to fire on 20,000 Buddhists gathered in Hue, killing 8 children and 1 woman. Okay, this is just going to heighten the hostilities between the Buddhists and the Diem regime. Then something very significant occurred on June 11th. In June 11th, a Buddhist monk by the name of Quang Duc, and I'll spell it, THICHQUANGDUC. Quang Duc drove up at a crowded intersection in Saigon in a Cadillac, came out of the Cadillac, went into the lotus position. Another monk came over to help him douse himself with gasoline, and a match went off. And Quang Duc went up in flames. There was a crowd there because this had been anticipated. There were Buddhists all around. This was actually an American photographer, I believe it was Malcolm Brown, was told to be at that intersection because something big was going to happen. And of course, he took pictures of this. And the pictures were incredible because they were now, by Telestar, they were sent all across the world and appeared on front pages all over the world. And the picture of a human being in a very serene lotus position, engulfed in flames, went against the human sensibilities of mankind. That somebody would do this and withstand the absolute horror of being burned alive. And he stayed in that lotus position, and he did not until he finally, was charred and succumbed. Understand something. The Buddhists had been self-immolating for hundreds of years. It was their act of protest to give up their body. Okay, but to many of the Western societies, again, this was an act of horror that it was done. Once the flames went out, the rest of Quang Duc was burned, cremated, but they could never burn his heart. They tried 3 times, and his heart never burned. His remains are in a pagoda in Hawaii today, as well as the Cadillac that he drove up to that intersection on June 11th. This was a real turning point with Ngo Dinh Diem, because when Kennedy saw this, he was aghast that this was what was going on in Vietnam. And he started to believe that Diem did not have the support of his people. In August, Washington is going to cable Saigon, the Saigon embassy, recommending that Diem be removed. Now, removed, okay? Removed is a word that can be interpreted a number of ways. To the Americans, this was to be, to exile or to put them into the embassy or to somehow have a transition of power. But to others, this could mean execution, assassination. So that was the gray area regarding the cable sent to the Saigon embassy. Ambassador Nolting, we mentioned before, was a Diem supporter, but he now was replaced in August of 1963 by Henry Cabot Lodge. This was a signal. This was a signal to Diem that his actions were being disproved of, because Nolting was a supporter. Henry Cabot Lodge was a Republican. He had been Nixon's running mate. And this signaled, first of all, bipartisanship, attempt by Kennedy, but it also sent a message to Diem, you're the man who has your back is now out. And this is in August of 63. And then things intensify. Cables are sent back to Washington when it was learned that there was a group of generals who were planning the coup. Kennedy was on vacation. He never really got full word of what was being planned there. And the middleman was Roger Hilsman. Roger Hilsman was a hawkish advisor, Kennedy, and he rewrote the cable and basically gave the okay for the generals to begin the coup. Now, the American OSS officer, actually CIA officer now, was Lucien Conein, okay, and that's pronounced or spelled Conein, Lucien Conein. He gave the okay. He received it from Hilsman. Hilsman passed it on to the ambassador, and the generals were released. Now, what they had in mind, of course, was a complete coup, a complete takeover. It wasn't yet determined that it was going to be an assassination. But we're going to stop there, because I think this next episode, which really only lasts over a course of a day and a half, is deep. Okay, it is deep. It has mystique to it. It has a lot of back doors, and there are underground tunnels, and there are a lot of intrigue, etc. So we're going to save that for our next podcast. Well, we'll see you again. Thanks, Mac. We'll talk to you again.
Thank you, Dr. Bob, for that presentation on the reign of the first South Vietnamese president, Ngo Dinh Diem. It's easy to see why there were so many problems in South Vietnam, not just military, but political and religious challenges. I look forward to the next episode, where you're going to describe in detail how Diem left office, and it is not going to be a pretty story. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1705 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?